In late August of 2013, Johnson City, Tennessee was shaken to its core. News broke of a murder, but not just any murder. This was one of their own, a police officer found dead in a secluded area. The discovery stunned everyone who knew him and sent shockwaves through the community. Michael McLennan was the last person anyone would expect to see in a headline like this. He was a well-known officer, a familiar face in town, respected and admired by his peers. But when he was found, the situation was far from ordinary. There were clear signs that this wasn't a random attack. Details began to emerge that painted a disturbing picture, one that pointed to something much deeper than anyone could have imagined. As investigators began to dig, the story became darker and more complex. Behind the scenes of his public life, there was a side of Mike's world that most people would have never guessed. This case wasn't just about solving a murder, it was about uncovering the secrets that had finally caught up with him. Mike McLennan was not only an officer, but also a family man. Married to his high school sweetheart, Kellyanne, he built a life that seemed straight out of a storybook. They had 2 young kids, a cozy home in the suburbs, and a routine that looked rock solid. Friends described them as the perfect family, with Kellyanne devoting her time to her kids and the community, while Mike worked long shifts to keep the streets safe. Yet, as perfect as it all seemed, there was an undeniable shift in Mike's behavior over time. Behind closed doors, he wasn't the same dependable, caring husband Kellyanne had married. She felt the growing distance but couldn't place exactly what was wrong. Something was gnawing away at their marriage, and she was left guessing, piecing together little signs that didn't add up. While Kellyanne tried to hold on to the life they'd built, Mike was leading a life filled with secrets that he kept from his family, his colleagues, and his entire community. Everything took a darker turn one evening when Mike arrested a young man named Skylar Farber. Skylar was only 18, fresh out of high school, and facing charges for marijuana possession. It seemed like a straightforward arrest, one of many Mike had made over his career. But this time, he made an unusual offer to Skylar, a deal that would set off a series of events none of them could control. Instead of charging Skylar, Mike offered him a way out. But it came with a disturbing condition. Skylar would have to meet with him privately, under terms Mike dictated. Desperate and frightened of the legal consequences, Skylar agreed, thinking it was his only option. What started as a secret arrangement quickly turned into something far more twisted. For Skylar, the relationship came with fear and confusion, mixed with resentment. For Mike, it became a dangerous game of trying to keep his personal and professional lives separate while carrying a heavy burden of guilt and shame. But no matter how well he hid it, the walls between his 2 lives were starting to crumble. As Mike continued his hidden relationship with Skylar, he found himself increasingly tangled in his own web of lies. What began as a way to satisfy his urges became a source of constant anxiety. He was always looking over his shoulder, trying to keep his secret from his family, his friends, and his colleagues. The stress weighed heavily on him, pushing him into an even darker mindset. Meanwhile, Skylar was also feeling the pressure. Though he had avoided jail, he now felt trapped in a situation he couldn't escape. The power dynamic between them was clear. Mike held all the control, and Skylar knew it. Mike's promises of helping him start a better life felt empty, leaving Skylar frustrated and angry. He was torn between fear and resentment, wondering if he would ever be free from Mike's influence. As the secrecy continued, Mike became increasingly paranoid. He went to great lengths to keep up appearances, crafting alibis and covering his tracks to maintain the life everyone believed he led. But each lie brought him closer to a breaking point, with no way out of the cycle he'd created. Kellyanne, on the other hand, was left in the dark, but she sensed something was wrong. Mike's behavior had changed. He was distant, distracted, and often gone without explanation. She found herself questioning their marriage, wondering if it was something she had done. While she tried to convince herself that it was just stress from his job, a nagging feeling kept telling her there was more to it. One day, as she was cleaning up around the house, Kellyanne stumbled upon something she couldn't ignore. Hidden in a closet, she found items that left her with more questions than answers. She didn't want to believe what she was seeing, but the evidence was right there, suggesting that Mike was hiding something serious. She chose not to confront him, hoping she was wrong, but the discovery weighed on her mind, deepening the distance between them. Kellyanne tried to hold their family together, believing that whatever was troubling Mike could be worked through. But little did she know, she was only seeing a glimpse of the secrets he was carrying, secrets that were about to unravel in a way she could never have imagined. On a quiet morning in late August, everything changed. A local hiker, Doug Harper, was walking his usual trail near Buffalo Mountain Park when he stumbled upon a horrifying sight. There, in a secluded clearing, lay a lifeless body, face down and battered. Doug immediately felt a chill run down his spine. His routine hike had suddenly turned into a nightmare. Panicked, Doug called 911, reporting what he had found. Within minutes, police and paramedics arrived, sealing off the area and beginning their investigation. The body was soon identified as Officer Michael McLennan. News of his death spread quickly, and the community was stunned. People who had known him as a dedicated officer and family man couldn't believe that such a brutal crime had taken place, especially to someone they respected. The initial signs at the scene suggested that this wasn't just a random act of violence. There were clear indications that Mike had fought back, and the brutality of his injuries pointed to something deeply personal. For the investigators, this was no ordinary case. They knew they were dealing with a story that went far beyond a simple crime. It was the beginning of an unraveling tale of secrets and betrayal. As detectives began their work at the scene, they noticed disturbing details that hinted at a complex and violent story. Mike's injuries were severe, with blunt force trauma to his head and defensive wounds on his arms, suggesting he had tried to defend himself against his attacker. The brutality of the attack left no doubt that this was a crime driven by intense emotions. As they examined the area, something else became clear. The scene seemed staged. Blood spatter was minimal, leading detectives to believe that Mike's body might have been moved or that the attack had started somewhere else. This raised questions about who might have lured him to such a remote location and why. Each piece of evidence added a new layer of mystery. Investigators were faced with a grim puzzle, one that suggested Mike's life had been far more complicated than anyone had realized. The violent nature of the crime indicated that whoever did this was no stranger to him. For detectives, the case was becoming a high-stakes search not only for the killer but also for the truth hidden in Mike's double life. With Mike's death sending shockwaves through the community, detectives turned their focus to those closest to him. The investigation led them to Skylar Farber, the young man Mike had arrested months earlier. Skylar's connection to Mike wasn't widely known, but detectives had uncovered hints of their complicated relationship, raising suspicions that he knew more than he was letting on. When Skylar was brought in for questioning, he seemed nervous and guarded. At first, he denied any involvement, but as detectives pressed him, cracks began to show in his story. Eventually, under the weight of the questioning, he admitted to having a secret relationship with Mike, one that had left him feeling trapped and resentful. Skylar revealed the darker side of their connection, claiming that he had been manipulated and controlled, a pawn in Mike's hidden life. His confession opened up a troubling line of inquiry for the detectives. They now had a clearer picture of Mike's actions and the complex, toxic bond he had formed with Skylar. But this revelation only deepened the mystery, adding layers to a case that was proving to be as twisted as it was tragic. While Skylar's confession shed light on Mike's hidden life, it also left Kellyanne shattered. When detectives shared the details of Mike's relationship with Skylar, she was blindsided. Everything she thought she knew about her husband came crashing down in that moment. The man she had loved and built a life with had been living a lie, deceiving her and their children. Kellyanne struggled to process the betrayal, the shame, and the grief. She recounted to detectives the signs she had ignored, the late nights, the secrecy, and the distance that had grown between them. Yet, even with her suspicions, nothing could have prepared her for this revelation. She had been unknowingly caught in the middle of Mike's secret world, and now she was left to face the aftermath. For Kellyanne, it wasn't just the loss of her husband, but the loss of the life they'd shared, a life built on illusions. The investigation was no longer just a search for justice, but a reckoning with the pain left in the wake of Mike's choices. As investigators dug deeper, a disturbing pattern began to emerge. Mike's relationship with Skylar wasn't an isolated incident, it was just one of many. Detectives uncovered a series of secret encounters that Mike had arranged with other young men over the years. Each time, he had used his position as a police officer to manipulate them, often targeting those he arrested, offering them a way out in exchange for something far more personal. This revelation turned the case on its head. Mike, once seen as a respected figure in the community, was now exposed as a predator who had used his authority for his own gain. The local police department, once proud of his service, felt the weight of shame and disbelief. Colleagues who had trusted him were horrified by the extent of his hidden actions, and the community's faith in their police force was deeply shaken. The investigation was no longer just about finding Mike's killer. It had evolved into a broader search for answers and accountability. Detectives faced the grim task of uncovering the full extent of Mike's abuse of power, knowing that each new piece of evidence revealed a deeper betrayal of trust. One of the individuals investigators interviewed was DeJount Moore, a young man who, like Skylar, had been drawn into Mike's web. DeJount had a troubled past and had long struggled with feelings of loneliness. When Mike initially approached him, DeJount believed he had finally found someone who cared. Mike's attention made him feel valued, and he convinced himself their relationship was special. However, as time went on, DeJount realized he was simply another target in Mike's hidden life. He felt used and manipulated, his self-worth shattered as he faced the truth. When police questioned him after Mike's murder, DeJount shared his heartbreak and anger, recounting the promises Mike had made, only to leave him feeling discarded. DeJounty's story painted a picture of a man who had not only betrayed his family and community, but who had preyed on vulnerable young men seeking acceptance. His account was another painful reminder of the damage Mike had left behind, a ripple effect of betrayal that continued to unravel as the investigation moved forward. As more stories like DeJounty's emerged, the detectives began to piece together a clear motive for the murder. Skylar, feeling increasingly trapped and manipulated, had reached his breaking point. The lies, broken promises, and constant control had left him desperate for an escape. Tensions between him and Mike had been building, creating an environment charged with resentment and anger. On the night of Mike's death, Skylar decided to confront him. Fueled by a mix of fear and fury, he lashed out, unable to hold back the emotions that had been simmering under the surface. What began as a heated argument quickly spiraled out of control, with Skylar acting in a moment of blind rage. In that instant, his frustration and pain turned deadly. This confrontation marked the tragic end of a toxic relationship built on manipulation and secrecy. The investigation had finally brought the pieces together, revealing how a hidden life of power and control had led to such a violent and heartbreaking conclusion. The trial that followed was intense, with the courtroom filled with people eager to see justice served. Skylar's defense argued that he hadn't been in his right mind when he attacked Mike, claiming that years of manipulation had pushed him to a breaking point. They presented evidence of Skylar's troubled history, showing how vulnerable he had been to Mike's influence. The prosecution, however, painted a different picture. They argued that while Skylar had been manipulated, his actions on the night of the murder were deliberate. They described the violent nature of the attack, highlighting the brutality as evidence that this wasn't an impulsive act, but a calculated decision made in anger. The jury listened to each side, weighing the years of emotional damage against the terrible crime that had been committed. After days of testimony and arguments, the jury delivered its verdict. Skylar was found guilty, though his sentence reflected the complexity of the case. It was a moment of closure for the community, though the trial had left everyone with a deeper understanding of the human cost of deception and abuse of power. In the months following the trial, those left in the wake of this tragedy tried to rebuild their lives, each in their own way. Skylar, now in prison, faced the consequences of his actions daily. He spent much of his time reflecting on the choices that had led him to that fateful night, grappling with guilt, anger, and regret. In an effort to find some sense of purpose, he enrolled in classes and attended therapy sessions, hoping to understand himself better and perhaps prevent others from making similar mistakes. For Kellyanne, the journey was different. After the shock and betrayal, she sought peace in a path she had never considered before. Turning to her faith, she made a decision to dedicate her life to helping others. She joined a convent and began working with troubled youth, channeling her pain into a mission to make a positive impact on those at risk. Meanwhile, DeJount took his own painful experience and turned it into a voice for change. He became an advocate for criminal justice reform, sharing his story to highlight the need for accountability within the system. His efforts gained attention, and he began speaking at events, using his platform to call for better protections against abuse of power. Each of them carried scars from the events surrounding Mike's life and death. Yet, in their separate journeys, they found a way to move forward, showing that even after the darkest moments, there is a path toward healing and change. The story of Michael McLennan left a lasting impact on Johnson City, lingering as both a cautionary tale and a reminder of the hidden struggles that can lie beneath the surface of seemingly ordinary lives. For the community, the tragedy highlighted the importance of accountability and transparency within trusted institutions. People began to question how someone with such a dark side could have remained undetected for so long, prompting discussions about reform and oversight within the police department. In the wake of this case, local leaders took steps to rebuild public trust. launching initiatives to improve the vetting process for officers and create safer avenues for reporting misconduct. Support groups formed to help those affected by similar situations, offering a place for victims to share their stories and find support. Though the pain of the events would never fully fade, the community sought to grow from it, fostering a culture that encouraged vigilance, openness, and compassion. Johnson City had been shaken, but as time passed, it stood determined to learn from the past, honoring the lessons left behind by those forever changed.